Who is Kevin Pickard? When did you first realise you wanted to be an entrepreneur? How did you get your first guest on the Rogue Monkey podcast? Welcome to the JOD Pod, a micro podcast where we interview CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, authors, and coaches. Today we are joined by Kevin Pickard, the founder of the Rogue Monkey and the host of the Rogue Monkey podcast. Great to have you with us today, Kevin.
Thank you, James. Great to be here and very much looking forward to exploring, just where we're going to go with all of this, because it's a new venture for you as well.
It's new, and now I need to publish this early on in the release schedule so that it sounds like it's a new venture as well. That's brilliant.
That was my way of getting in there early.
Good tactic. I like it. So for those who don't know who Kevin is, who is Kevin Pickard?
Okay, so I used to be an athlete, not to any particular high standard, but certainly, it took up a huge amount of my time. Went into the world of coaching and then talent development, worked across a huge range of sports clubs in the east of England over a period of about 3.5 years. And now I work in the world of sports innovation as a business consultant, primarily in the world of sport, but there is quite a lot of overlap because obviously the world's lessons that you learn in sport are very applicable in the worlds of business, especially performance sport. So that's where I'm up to.
Man, that sounds absolutely awesome. So you're running your own business now. You're an entrepreneur. When did you first realize you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
I think it was actually listening to another entrepreneur actually saying the biggest challenge that you'll ever have as an entrepreneur is taking the first step. And it's always more scary than what you think it's going to be. And especially when you're starting out, especially with something like a podcast, you haven't got an audience because you're starting at zero. So if it goes horribly wrong on the first episode, it doesn't matter because no one's watching. And, and then by the time you share 1 or 2 shows and you build up a bit of an audience, you've also got 1 or 2 or 3 hours of experience. It then gets to a point where you become more confident in doing it. As long as you've got a relatively good group of honest people around you, you get feedback. We were having some early discussions in the early days of the pod, and you get to a point where actually it's just an ever-evolving beast and you become more comfortable sitting in that uncertain place. And I think that's one of the things that I thrive on, because to go back into the sports world, that's what makes sports so exciting. We don't know who's going to win that race or score the last goal or whatever it is. And when you exist in the business world and you can sit in that little grey area where things are a bit uncertain, a bit bumpy, and you're not sure what's going on, but it's exciting, that's a really cool place to be. So I guess I found something that transferred the excitement that I got from sport into a day-to-day job, and that was sustainable long-term. So that's kind of how I guess I first fell into this world.
That's brilliant. And that's so good to hear as well, because part of the reason of this podcast is to help inspire people to step out of their comfort zone and try something new and create something. And hearing that from you, from someone that's moved from the world of sport into entrepreneurship, I think is really exciting. How did you get your first guest on the Rogue Monkey podcast?
So it's quite a cool story, actually. So it wasn't originally going to be a podcast. Back in 2017, I was at an international competition in Budapest, and I was at the bar, as you always are when you're a serious athlete, and I was chatting to an American guy. It was a world competition, so there's people from all over the place, and super passionate, super outgoing guy, really big now on YouTube and stuff like that. But he had just started, or he'd been relatively early into a startup at that point, and he was telling us about it. He was so excited and so passionate. Anyhow, connected on Facebook and swapped numbers, etc. Kept in touch, and I started to see, over the years following that, it growing and building, and we'd ping messages backwards and forwards. And I said, hey, it'd be really cool to have a catch up. And this was pre-COVID, so still there wasn't really an agenda to this. It was just a catch up. And we were chatting away, and he's like, hey, we should, you should really kind of think about potentially doing something with this, because we had a really in-depth conversation, and it kind of dawned on me that actually across my sporting journey and my various roles, I'd had so many amazing conversations, but they were just moments in time, which was great for me, selfishly, but actually for everybody else, I could tell them the story, but you can never quite capture that moment of a story because it's always secondhand. So it came to a point where I said to Perez, the guy I did my first episode with, shall we try a podcast? Let's have a go. And off we did. We went, we had a go. It was cool. We put it out there. That was a guy in America. The next podcast was with a guy in Australia. And suddenly it was like, oh, this isn't as scary as you thought, because after about 30 seconds of you starting and you realize actually it's just you two having a conversation, you just relax a little bit. And at that point, you then thought, right, who else have I had conversations with over the last 5, 10, 15 years of my career that actually would be really cool to share? And, you've been on the podcast, and I've connected with so many people retrospectively that I used to work with or I've crossed paths with in one of my various jobs. And actually, you get the chance to explore that discussion again, but actually then share that with a lot of people. And then they get in touch and go, oh, I love what you were talking about. You need to speak to this guy or this girl or whoever it is. And suddenly you're having a conversation with somebody completely different. And that's how it's evolved. And then, we're knocking on 50 episodes now. So it's good fun.
Wow, that's awesome. And again, that's such an inspiring story to hear that, you said before, like when you first start off, nobody really notices what you're doing. No one's going to care. Like you can really overthink that first step. But for you, just jumping on a call and recording that conversation and then turning that into something, publishing it, like that's the fear, is pressing the button. But getting over that, as you say, you quickly get over that, and then you build momentum, and then you're flying. And KP, you are flying at the moment. What are you working on at the moment? I know you've got a few different things that you're spending your time focused on.
Yeah, so I split my time quite a few ways. I wear lots of different hats, shall we say. I guess the bulk of my time in terms of daytime, I work with a professional swimmer called Adam Peaty and his business team, somebody who I'll mention a little bit later, but doing a lot of work around what they're doing in sport. So Adam's a fantastic athlete, got big ambitions himself as an athlete, but also the impact that he has on sports community. And a lot of that involves development work, networking, building new projects, going on tour after the Olympics, those sorts of things. So I'm effectively quarterbacking that and giving, I guess, more on the ground operational support for those sorts of things. So
for those
that's,
of
I
us,
guess, strand number one.
For those of us that aren't American, what does quarterback mean? Like what?
Oh, that's a great question. I've just coined the phrase and never really thought too deeply into it. But I guess not being front and center on it, sitting in the background and just giving some support as and when it's needed. So that's strand number one. Strand number two, I'm doing some work with a platform called GoVox. They work in the mental health and well-being space. They work with businesses. They work with educational providers, and they are now working more and more with sports teams. They're in EFL. They work with the England swim team, amongst many others. And that's been really, really cool to work with them and explore their product and help shape it specifically for sports clubs, because that was my background and I felt like there was a massive gap in the market. And actually, a lot of young athletes are having well-being and mental health issues, especially off the back of the pandemic. And there's nothing to recognize it and find the trail of breadcrumbs that can often lead to deteriorating mental health. So I'm doing some work with them. And then the final part, I guess, which is the hobby in inverted commas that's grown quite quickly, is the podcast. I'd done about 5 or 6 episodes before COVID came along. And suddenly it was supercharged because everyone got put on furlough for a month or two. You're contacting anyone and everyone's at home, so they're free to have a conversation. And I think by the time we got to Christmas, I'd banked like 40 episodes. And like these, I know obviously you're doing kind of a micro pod. Some of the ones I'm doing are like hour and a quarter, hour and a half. And obviously you've got to listen back, you've got to edit, you've got to do all the prep work and all those sorts of things. And obviously speak to these people, do the research. If it's an author, I'm reading their books. So it snowballed so quickly to a point, where I effectively stepped out of my full-time job in inverted commas back at the start of March, worked full-time doing these various projects. And actually it's evolved into something that's really exciting, but also really uncertain. And I'm really enjoying that. Being comfortable, being uncomfortable has kind of been where I've got to now, to a point where actually I look at that and go, I don't know how it's going to work out. And that doesn't scare me.
That's fantastic. And the podcast, that's the catalyst for everything that you're doing. It's you become a node in a network and get known within that network, and that creates then opportunities for you to do what you do.
Yeah, and I think also you become comfortable knocking on doors. So, like for example, with the stuff I'm doing with Adam, he's going on tour. All things being equal after the Olympics, and we're going to 10 different sites in England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, to be able to just comfortably get in touch with coaches you've never met and say, hey, I want to bring the tour to your town, your club. Can you put us in touch with the leisure centres, et cetera, et cetera? You've got to have a bit of confidence to do that. And I think those were the kind of things where actually, when it was like, right, we want to put this together, it was like, I'm comfortable doing that. And I think that's it. I didn't plan that, but that's how it's worked out. And I think that some people, like having too many plans in place. And sometimes if you think too much about step 100, you kind of trip over on step 1, 2, and 3 because you're not actually looking where you're going. And that's something I've been very fortunate that I've slowly got rid of that worry and got to a point now where I can every day, even this morning, I was on the phone to a performance director out in Denmark working with fencing, completely change of sport, but an ex-British Olympian. And we were having this fascinating discussion about supporting athletes in the future and what we can do from a mentoring point of view. And then I'm jumping on a call with you and it's completely different. And we're talking about other stuff. And then this afternoon, it's completely different again. So I think, that's something that I hadn't planned, but that's kind of how it's worked out. And you do, if you immerse yourself in that world, opportunities come to you. And, there's so many people that say, I'm lucky, but I've worked really hard. And it's like, I think luck has some element to play in it. But the more you put yourself out there, luck tends to find its way to you quite often.
Yeah, putting yourself out there, you give yourself a wider surface area to receive luck. That's basically what it's about. Getting yourself out there to to create those opportunities. And I think the other thing as well that you do very well is that you focus on picking up information one or two steps ahead of where you're at, rather than looking, as you say, 100 steps ahead, because there's loads of information out there, and actually being able to have a filter and focus on what you need to learn next, not what you need to learn in a couple of years' time. From me seeing what you've been doing, I think that's been really impressive. Kevin, are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Fire away. I've got my holsters ready.
Wow, terrifying. Kevin, what's your favourite app or SaaS product that you use every day?
That is a really good question. And the reason I struggled with that is because when we first spoke, I was playing around with a few different things. Nothing's really stuck. And I think that's because purely I haven't had the time to sit and really invest in that yet. I'm also spinning the plate of a master's. I probably should have mentioned that. I'm also doing a master's on the side just because I'm not busy enough. That finishes though in a couple of months. So I actually would go back to say that I actually use a diary. And I've found strictly using a diary. So every day, not writing a to-do list, but planning out my time for that day. At the end of the day, reflecting on what's been done, what needs to be done, etc., etc. That's something I found really useful. Now, I'm sure there's lots of tech people screaming at the screen going, you need to be using this, including yourself. And I probably will. It's, to be honest, like when I use stuff like that I have so integrated to different areas of my life, I like to do it properly. And not kind of mess around with it. So at the moment, I'm just using a very, very nice diary, and every single day it goes in there what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, what needs to be picked up. I obviously use like all the digital stuff like everyone else, like your calendars and things, but that's something that's really helped me moving away from to-do lists and actually just planning out my days to get jobs done.
Man, that's useful when you get a lot done in a day. Anybody can that follows you can see that. So that's a really interesting insight into your world. Thanks, Kevin. What's your most recommended book?
Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed is probably the one that jumps out at me. I only got that for Christmas, so it's a relatively recent book. I try and read a book every other week. So on top of podcasts and audio books, I get through quite a lot. But to be honest, there's so many, and I think it depends on who I'm having a conversation with as to kind of thing, whether it's creative stuff, sports stuff, journey stuff, life bios, that are overcoming adversity. The thing I liked about that Rebel Ideas, there's so many different angles that it comes at, and that's something for me that I like being different. I like questioning and prodding and being the 10th person who doesn't agree with the other 9, and not for the sake of causing trouble, for the sake of actually going, just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean there's not potentially a different way of looking at this. And that book was an epitome of that. So that's probably my one that jumps out.
That's one of my favourite quotes from Hopper, the computer scientist. She said that we've always done it this way is one of the most dangerous phrases in the human language. So I think that's a really, really good mindset to get yourself in as a new entrepreneur. Who's your favourite YouTuber or podcaster at the moment, Kevin?
I'm taking 2 just because I can. So I've got into 2. One relatively recently, Steve Bartlett. Very big on YouTube, recently sold his company, so spends a lot of time putting out a lot of content. I've learned quite a lot off him, the good and the bad and the ugly, and he has a lot of interesting guests on. And then the High Performance Podcast with Jake Humphrey and Damien Hughes. Very fortunate to have interviewed both of them relatively early on in their podcast journeys, and have kind of followed how they've evolved and developed their podcast, and again learned a lot from them and their guests. So that in both on YouTube and podcast wise, those are my big hitters.
Who do you think the next Elon Musk or Denise Coates, the CEO of Bet365, might be?
No, I thought about this, and I thought I can pluck things out of the air here for people that I don't know. Or on a slightly more localized scale, I can pick on a couple of people that I do know. And, very fortunate to have, again, met a lot of really cool people across my podcast journey. I did an interview back in my first season, actually, with the guy who founded Adam Peaty's Race Clinics tour when they first tried it quite a few years ago, a guy called Ed Baxter. He's making huge leaps in the world of sport, very young, very open minded, didn't go to university, studied in a very untraditional way, and is very forwards thinking in the way he approaches problems. He doesn't see the obstacles, he just sees a challenge that we will figure out a way to get around. Um, he's also one of Adam's coaching team, and I think when you operate in that elite 0.1% space working with world-class athletes, you're always looking for different ways to improve, and he embodies that. So that's my first one. I think he's going to make big strides in the sports world. And then the second one was actually a lady I came across back in season 4 of the podcast with a young lady called Sarah Richard. She's the founder of an organization called Girls That Scuba, and basically it found that there was a zero or a gap in the market, if you like, but zero support for females that were involved in the activity of scuba diving around the world. She set up a network back in 2016. It's got 750,000 people now on the network. So it's grown exponentially, and she's still running it herself. She set up a shop doing waste-free plastic products plastic-free products to avoid obviously polluting oceans. And she's doing the whole lot herself. She's running out of she's doing podcasts, she's doing TikToks, all these sorts of things. And I'm like, it's just incredible. Really good, again, entrepreneurship from her. So they're two that stuck out for my sphere that I think are going to do great things.
Well, that's exactly what I'm looking for there, is people that are in your sphere that other people might not know about, but are on an upward trajectory. They're fantastic suggestions there. Thanks very much for that, Kevin. And where's the best place for people to find you, Kevin, if they want to follow up on your story and all the work that you're doing?
I think, to be honest, obviously everyone's different. So I try and cover all the bases. So, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, use LinkedIn as well quite extensively. And then I've got a website, both for myself and for the podcast, but just the wider brand, the Rogue Monkey. So if you go on any of them and just search for the Rogue Monkey or Kevin Pickard, you'll find me. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that we can have ways that we prefer stuff, but actually when you're working with a public facing audience, you have to put yourself in the eyes of them. So if it's somebody who's really busy and hasn't got time to sit in front of a screen and watch a YouTube video, they might not want to watch a YouTube video. So actually an audio version is better for them. But then actually some people are not they might just want to read. So actually, can you convert some of those episodes into a blog post? So I think that I've kind of figured that out over a relatively short period of time, that actually you can't just go down one route. You've got to have a range of angles that you get your content out through, but also the way people can come towards you and contact you, because if you stick with one, you're already going to be alienating 3/4 of the audience out there.
I think repurposing your idea and your brand and your content is absolutely essential, because you never know the situation that someone's in and what impact that might have on them. That's really great. There we have it. Kevin is the founder of the Rogue Monkey, where he provides sports business consultancy and hosts the ever popular The Rogue Monkey podcast. Definitely check that out. He managed to get his first guest through networking and following up with his current existing contacts. His favourite app is a diary, pen and paper, basic planning and executing. Big thing for Kevin there, I think. His most recommended book is Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed. He loves watching and listening to Steve Bartlett, who I understand is a new dragon on Dragon's Den, and the High Performance Podcast with Jake Humphrey and Damian Hughes. He thinks that we should be keeping an eye on Ed Baxter in the world of sports and Sarah Richard in the world of Girls That Scuba. 750,000 community is incredible. And you can find out more about Kevin and the Rogue Monkey podcast by heading to www.theroguemonkey.org, where you'll see all of Kevin's contact details, the Rogue Monkey's contact details, and links to his podcast. Kevin, thank you for joining us today on the JOD Pod.
James, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
And thank you for joining us on today's interview on the JOD Pod. To ensure you don't miss any of these episodes, make sure that you hit subscribe, hit that bell, and hit that like button for Kevin's interview. If you got any questions for me or Kevin about starting a podcast, sports, or mental health in sports, then leave them below. I know Kevin will get back to every single one of them, and it helps Kevin out, it helps the show out. So ask a question. Kevin will come by and answer it, I'm sure. Hopefully you've been inspired by Kevin today. You know, he started a business out of nothing in the last 12 months. So go build something yourself. Go and inspire the next generation. Thank you for joining us today on the JOD Pod. If you enjoyed this interview, why don't you check out some of these other interviews that we've done on the JOD Pod. More inspirational CEOs, coaches, entrepreneurs, founders, and authors. I'm sure there's something here that will inspire you to build something new.